talk.
Be a leader, not a follower.
I know.
This is not for my benefit. It's for you, to keep you.
Every day, from childhood until now, the same thing, the rules, over and over, drummed into my head, always behind closed doors. As a youth, I breathed their mantra and left it on the doorstep as I walked out into my life.
Don't make police come out this yard. Now make me have to left work to come out of school.
Man, I know. That was a mistake. Raising my voice. Lecture 4729 would be next. You're not the same as them. Don't let them fool you. I didn't raise you to be nobody's fool. More often than not, I have sense knocked back into me.
Don't get in no mix-up, because you'll be the one to get in problems whether it's you or not, because you are the black one.
It's not like that anymore. I tried to tell them that my mates are blood brothers. Nothing will separate us. They didn't laugh much at things I said, but that always made them crease up.
If you don't hear, you will feel. There are different rules. Remember, you're not white.
That's the start of lecture 1536, a firm favourite in our household.
Bruv, you're different. I don't see you as black. But I see them every day, playing the race card to get out of their own trouble. I don't ever get to play the race card.
Who controls the pack of race cards?
Black people, of course. Or is it people of colour now? Or BAME minorities? That's what I mean.
Minorities are all powerful then?
Well, no. But still they get advantages, if you know what I mean.
Advantages? Let's come back to that one, okay? How about this? When was the last time someone who looked like you was told by their parents, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far as someone like me?
That's just silly. This is a meritocracy. Everybody has a fair chance at progression in society.
That's just willful ignorance talking. Let's talk about white privilege as friends.
There's no such thing. I don't have any privileges for being white. You work hard, you get ahead. That's all there is to it. Anything else is...
Is what?
There's no point in discussing this. It always comes back to how hard life is because...
Go on, say it. Because I'm black.
I don't see colour with you. I mean, you're you. So why are you playing the race card?
Playing the race card. For real. The go-to response for most racists who don't want to be called out on their racism. I see you, bruv.
Nah, Brian, mate. What you have to understand is we don't live in the past. We live now.
Everything we are right now is born out of the past. Both of us. How can we even think of ignoring it?
Here's the problem with that. You have to let it go and just get on with life as it happens. Stop griping all the time. For God's sake, slavery is over. You need to let it go. Forget about it. We have. It serves no good purpose to talk about that sort of thing anymore.
Life looks different to you.
How so?
Did you ever have the talk? Also known as living while black in a hostile environment.
Of course not.
Exactly. Answer me this. Why do you call me Brian?
That's your name, fool.
Nah, it's not. It's Bryden. 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 It's been in my family for generations.
You never said?
I did. You said Brian was easier to remember.
Sorry, bruv, but everyone calls you that.
Not my family. Only outsiders.
Are you calling me a racist?
Bruv, you've more experience with being a racist than I ever could. Wait. But I, sadly, have more lived experiences of racism than you could imagine.
I'm not a racist.
Okay, name me some classical composers.
You mean like Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Puccini, Salieri, and maybe Bach?
How easy are they to say? Bryden's not quite like them, is it?
Guess not, but
But they're white and European, right? What I need is for you to listen, not to explain my actual experience back to me through the prism of your whiteness. Bear in mind that may also include the intersectionality of class and social inequalities as well.
and here I was thinking we were friends. Instead, I'm getting a lecture.
Friends know and understand each other. You don't know me. Acquaintances, on the other hand.
Brutal. You lot are always in the news for something, no? You never see the likes of me on TV or anything.
You can have it all. The multiple stop and searches. The here's the package comment when I'm there for an interview, not as a delivery man. They're not bothering to learn my name properly.
Come on, man. I didn't know.
The sexualization and criminalization of my blackness all in the same glance. It's tiring.
Look, I'm sorry. I didn't realise. What can I do?
Educate yourself. Do the work. Remember, we all live the consequences of our history.
Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
A thought-provoking piece, I think everybody will agree. I'm going to move on now to talk about an initiative that is being run by Hope University. I've been collaborating with Hope on behalf of Liverpool City Council to make sure that we have something that is a viable contribution to Black lives in this city. And that's the Black Access course to social work, a route into the profession for members of diverse communities. And whilst this is a wonderful opportunity and a fantastic programme, I think the question in the back of everybody's mind is, why are we having to do a positive action programme all these years after the first positive action programme for social workers, which was in the 1980s? We've got people joining us today who are them very same social workers who came through an access to sociology and psychology programme. Unfortunately, They're now reaching retirement age. Many were mature students when they embarked on this profession. And that has flagged up for us the fact that we're going to have a huge gap in terms of Black social workers. And I use the word Black in the political sense as all encompassing for all of our diverse communities. And so later on today, there will be more discussion about the programme. This is not just a programme, an ordinary programme for Hope University, although the content is the same. What is different about this is about the infrastructure that is being put in place. Because whilst dealing with equality, we can't not deal with economic equality. And so we need to find a way where our Black sisters and brothers are not only coming to the table to contribute in terms of our understanding and our concepts around racism, but also gain from the opportunity by being able to be employed as peer group mentors or practice educators, etc. And so it's a different way of looking at an age-old problem. And I'm sure there'll be more discussion about this today. And I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna, for that. So I'm going to, it's just gone past 10 o'clock, so I'm going to pass over to Wayne Reid and Maris Stratulis, who are joining us from BASW, Association of Social Workers.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. Lovely video there, by the way, and thank you for the words that you said, Anna, also. Maris Stratulis is supposed to be joining me this morning. I can't see her on the screen. I know that she's had some recent Wi-Fi issues recently, so we may well have lost Maris, but I'll sort of crack on if that's okay, which is fine. So let me share my screen, Scott. Hopefully it will work first time as it did earlier. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can see that fine, Wayne.
Excellent. Okay, so as I say, hopefully Maris will join me shortly, but she has had some Wi-Fi issues recently. This is Maris's background. Maris is the National Director at BASW England. We'll tell you more about BASW and what that stands for and what we're about shortly. But Maris is my manager, effectively, and I would normally do these presentations by myself. But what I wanted for this particular presentation is to have Maris with me, because I consider her a very strong ally, as well as my manager, but also she's native to Liverpool, and she's from Liverpool originally. So I discussed this with her some time ago, and she showed a real keen interest in coming. So it's really unfortunate that she can't be with us, but hopefully she can rejoin us shortly. This is a statement that Maris wanted to read out. I'll come back to that should she be able to join us in a moment. And this is Maris's perspective on anti-racism within social work. I'll let you read that briefly, but I just want to elaborate that I do consider Maris to be a great ally. You'll see some of the work that I've been involved in on behalf of BASW over the last 9 months over the course of this presentation. And Maris has been a great help and a great support with that. So I very much do consider her an ally. And as you can see there, she has a diverse heritage herself from a Greek background and Irish. And as I say, she's native to Liverpool. Here is a slide on my social work background. I'll not go through that in any detail, but you'll see also that I've had a colourful history in both social work, social care, and youth offending and criminal justice. And this is a slide on my perspective on anti-racism in social work. It is both personal and professional for me. There are very few Black male social workers. My opinion really shouldn't be considered as representing all Black and ethnic minority people's views on this, as we're not a homogeneous group. I refuse to be the tokenistic Black voice of BASW. I've said that from the outset of me engaging in this work. Again, I'll sort of elaborate more on that later on. But I'm very much one of many voices in social work. I'm just fortunate, I suppose, that I have a national role, a certain platform at BASW, and I'm fortunate that my voice is able to be heard. And I also like to emphasize that I'm by no means an expert in organizational development or leadership, but I do consider myself as an expert with lived experience of personal and professional racism in life and in social work. So again, these are purely my opinions. And I hope those images at the bottom there convey the tone really of this presentation. Just a very brief slide on my organisation, BASW, which is the British Association of Social Workers. We were formed in 1970, and this year is our 50th, last year was our 50th anniversary. And so we've been around a long time. And those images in the four corners you'll see are the different branding that we've had over the years. We're a member-led organisation which promotes social work and the profession and those working within the profession, but also people who use services. We have over 21,000 members across the UK, and we consider ourselves to be the strong, independent voice of social work and social workers. I'd like to just emphasize how I feel anti-racism is relevant to social work. So Social Work England, who are the regulators for social work, their professional standards state that all social workers must recognise differences across diverse communities and challenge the impact and disadvantage and discrimination on people and their families and their communities. And you'll see there are various other standards there which underline the importance of social justice, not abusing or neglecting or discriminating or exploiting people, reporting allegations of harm and challenging. There is no explicit mention of anti-racism, I might add, or anti-discriminatory or anti-oppressive practice, but you will see there that a lot of those terms do allude to that. But one of the things that we are campaigning for really is the explicit inclusion of anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and anti-discriminatory practice and values and ethics. Some of the other ways in which anti-racism correlates with social work is in terms of BASW's Code of Ethics. We recognise ourselves, we don't refer to those terms explicitly within that either. So there is work for us to do as an organisation, and we recognise that, and we will be undertaking a full review, an ongoing review of the Code of Ethics to incorporate that. There's also a bedrock of social justice in terms of anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist values and ethics in terms of social work academia and education. Maris, I can see that you've joined us now. I'm glad that you have. I gather that you must have had some Wi-Fi issues. So I'll come to you in a moment if that's all right.
Yeah, great.
Great. Also, BASW has issued 2 recent position statements condemning George Floyd's murder and promoting anti-racism in social work. One thing I should mention is where you can see this presentation has underlined sections, there are web links within the presentation. I will share it with Scott, so you should be able to get a copy of this and you'll be able to look at some of those different web links which will substantiate some of the points that we make. Also, there are some other links there at the bottom about confronting the white elephant, so white privilege in social services, cultural competence, which I'm sure you will have heard of or you will hear of as part of your studies in terms of social work practice. And there is a very strong and powerful movement now to decolonize broad education, but also within social work as well, and within policy. I'll hand over to you, Maris, at this point, if that's okay, just around the work streams that we've been involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you covered a little bit about your kind of personal views, Wayne, and your previous jobs.
I have, and what I did was I covered a little bit of your section in your absence. I hope that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. But I think what's really important is just to share you know, a little bit about my roots, actually. So I'm originally from Liverpool. My mum was an Irish immigrant. my father's heritage was Greek in origin, and my great grandfathers worked on the cotton as cotton porters in Liverpool. And I think what's really important is, again, I love, although I've moved away and I'm now in Derbyshire and with BASW in a different context, I really love my city, and I think it's really important that people connect with your roots and your heritage, but that you also acknowledge the history of where we all come from. And for me, as I say, I really love Liverpool, but also Liverpool has a history of shame in terms of transatlantic slavery, and the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool is a place that I would urge all of you, if you haven't been, I know you can't visit at the moment, but I think it's closed at the moment, but when that museum is open again, I would encourage as many of you as when it is safe to do, to make sure that you visit that museum. And that's about education, it's about learning. And I think what's about Brave is about that museum, is about action, it's about education, and it's moving forward in terms of community mobilization. So that's something really strong that I'd certainly recommend. In terms of my own views as a white woman, I have privilege. There is no doubt about that. And in terms of my family as well, and the heritage of my family, my mum certainly experienced prejudice as a white woman, as an Irish woman, and there were many comments made to her as a Catholic Irish woman, but she certainly did not experience racism. And I think today is also about the nuances and the challenges of that, but my experience as a white woman when I enter a room is very different to a black woman entering the room, and I'm using black in a political context here. So just a little bit of that I did want to revisit. I'm really sorry, there have been some significant technical problems today, and it may happen again, so as I say, between us we'll cover it in terms of Wayne.
We'll dial it out, that's fine.
As a white ally, I feel very strongly, and again, for people in the audience, this, as allies, it's about listening, it's about educating yourself, and in terms of your social work journey and your career pathway, that's both as a student, it's as a practitioner, it's having the courage to speak up, it's about action, it's about learning, and sometimes, on that journey, it's about being very uncomfortable at times, and that's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And today there may be some discussions where people aren't particularly feeling comfortable, and what I'm saying is that's also part of the journey as well. So certainly embrace it in terms of, embrace learning, anti-racism practice. Is a continuum, it's an ongoing journey, and within your education, your student placements, and your social work career, it's really critical in terms of the communities that you work with as well. So thanks for that, Wayne. I just wanted to flag that issue.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm glad you rejoined us at that point, actually, just before I got to the meaty stuff. And I'd already not covered that in detail, but I had said that, in my opinion, I consider you an ally, and a lot of the work that we've done, which we'll come on to shortly, over the last 9 months, I really couldn't have done a lot of that and spearhead a lot of that if I hadn't had your support, really. So, not to overdo it,
I'll pay you later.
I know, yeah, I've not brought you an apple or anything, but yeah, just wanted to make that point.
Yeah.
So just to get back to where we were then. So I was just talking about how anti-racism is relevant to social work. And although there's no explicit mention of that in the professional standards or the education and training standards, I might add, that is something that we are campaigning around. It is something we feel strongly about. And hopefully it's something we can get some movement on in the future. Did you want to say something? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think in terms of this slide that Wayne May covered, in terms of professional standards and your regulator, Social Worker England, as you go forward, it's about also influencing those standards in the future. And for HEIs as well, we know that there will be refresh of the standards. There's new education training standards in terms of implementation from 2021, but we would be saying, certainly in terms of curriculum, and from the earlier discussions that I was able to join, and I think with Anna's partnership with London Hope and the collective work that you're doing, it sounds as if there's really good models of good practice here, and I think it's how you can also influence the social work regulator in the future, and make sure that you get your mark and influence professional social work standards, because that is about changing the professionalism of the organization, but it's also about the longevity of education and continuous professional development. So I'd certainly strongly advocate that that's something, and really get a marker in the sand, you know, in terms of the work. As I say, it was just a snapshot from this morning's discussion, but I think there's some really innovative work that can be taken forward. And as Wayne has said, that we do know that education has also played its part in not sharing history, lying about history, and it's also for social work students and social work practitioners to bring that to the fore.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, the next slide is around the work streams. It's really just tip of the iceberg, but it's just a very brief snapshot of some of the work that we've been involved in, directly to do with anti-racism, but also more broadly in terms of some of the events that occurred last year, such as George Floyd's murder, for example, which was one of the things that really ignited for me the need and the passion to kind of get more directly involved in this work. I'm not going to label this slide because what I mentioned before is that, you know, you'll be able to get your copy of this presentation and look at some of those web links. There are others. There's also an anti-racist kind of portfolio that we have, so I'll share that with Scott and he can hopefully disseminate that to everyone. But you'll see there, just to give you a flavour, there's been different campaigns. I guess one of the key campaigns has been around the KCMG medal, which you will see in the bottom right hand corner there of the screen. Maris, did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's a Queen Award medal that's awarded to, particularly it can be awarded to ambassadors or people that have been involved in the Foreign Office as well. And the actual image of the medal, which is part of our campaign, is an image of a character, shall we say, standing on the neck of a Black person in terms of that image. And although it's...
Oh, I think we might have lost you, Maris. Not to worry. Hopefully she'll be able to resume in a moment. Oh, you're still there? You've come back. Oh, you're back.
Yeah. Yeah. So although it's contained within a narrative of history...
Oh, no. Another disconnect, I think. Let me fill in for you, Maris, if you can hear me. So that image is of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, what looks like an angel because it has wings, with its foot on the neck of what looks like a black man. It's supposed to be Satan. That medal has been around for a few hundred years, and that image came to light for me in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder last year. So it was something I felt really strongly and passionate about, as you can imagine. There was a kind of inadvertent Twitter campaign, shall we say, which was very kind of popular. And because of that, you know, it generated a lot of interest, and we began a campaign. We sent an open letter to the Queen, which you'll be able to see there in that web link. And we've had an acknowledgement, but our letter has been redirected and we're still waiting for some conclusion on that. It will be something that we'll be looking to revisit imminently. Okay, so I did say I wouldn't label this slide, and I kind of had, but there's kind of articles and things that I've written around anti-racism there, some that you may have already read. A group that that I founded at BASW called the Black and Ethnic Minority Professionals Symposium. Again, that link will take you to that group. Moving swiftly on. So this is just a visual representation of some of the work that I've been involved in on anti-racism. There is an anthology book that is due to be published in the next couple of months that I'm involved in partnership with a social worker called Siobhan McLean, who is also a publisher and practice educator. And we've collaborated to produce this book that is a creation of essays, stories, poems, and reflections from a number of different Black and ethnic minority social workers, conveying their perspectives in terms of not just anti-racism, but their lived personal and professional experiences. So it is quite unique. and we're really excited about that, so do look out for that book. There were a number of events that I spoke at last year. One of the more prominent ones was the Guardian Social Lives 2020 event. There's a flyer there for the BPS group that I mentioned, Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium. I also spoke at an event with David Olasuga and Isabel Trowler, who is the Chief Social Worker for Children and Families. David Olasuga, I'm sure you'll be aware of as a documentary maker around race and heritage and so on. And I found myself in a position where I had to go on after him, can you believe? Pretty quite daunting, but somehow managed to style that one out. And as I mentioned before, there's a number of articles that I've written around anti-racism as well. There was an event I spoke at with the anti-racist legends, who are Gurnam Singh and Kish Batty Sinclair, who are prominent pioneering social workers of anti-racism. So that was quite an honour, really, as well. And various other podcasts and webinars and so on, which I will share following this presentation. So Black Lives Matter, what's it about? Black Lives Matter is about them needing to matter more than they have. Society should value them equal to white lives and does not. The retort of white or all lives matter in response to BLM is not comparable or relevant. This is like asking, what about colon cancer during a discussion about breast cancer, or advising a bereaved mother that all lives matter at her child's funeral. Save the whales does not mean other sea life is unimportant. White lives have always mattered, so to keep proclaiming white lives matter adds excessive value to them, tilting us further towards white supremacy. BLM has its critics, but it is unclear why a movement that promotes equality is demonized by some people who vehemently claim they are not a racist and advocate freedom of speech. And the reason why I've put apostrophes around A there is that quite often people see being a racist as a black and white issue, whereas in my view, I believe there's a spectrum of racism there. And living in a system and a society where there are more and more examples of overt white supremacy, I think it's about how racist people are given that context, really, and a recognition of that and a resistance of that. I hope the image there illuminates my point. What is anti-racism? Anti-racism is a belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. But the most important part of anti-racism is the next step, which is to do something about the existing inequality. Anti-racism is the active dismantling of systems, privileges, and everyday practices that reinforce and normalize the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. And that's a quote from a book called How to Be a Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And again, I hope that image underlines my point. How much of a priority is anti-racism in social work, really? Anti-racism in social work must be fully considered and dismantled through collaboration with Black and ethnic minority social workers in roles as experts with personal and professional lived experience. It really is just a question of how much of a priority is anti-racism in social work. And I have to really emphasize that point because in the last 9 months that I've been involved in this work, that really is the issue. It seems to have been something that slid off the agenda even during that period. So I think we really have to separate the kind of realists from the pretenders. Anti-racism, so what? Blah, blah, yawn. Now, this is just a few quotes that I've taken. The first is one that I've altered slightly from Angela Davis. In a multifaceted racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. The next one is, being an ally doesn't necessarily mean you fully understand what it feels like to be oppressed. It means you are taking on the struggle as your own. the burden of ending racism should not be on those subjected to it, but on those who uphold and benefit from it. And finally, racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. And that was by Will Smith from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Now, this is an infographic that identifies 4 different types of white identity. The first being white supremacy, the next one is white indifference, then we have white awareness and white allyship. I think that this infographic is relevant to both individuals and organisations to be able to chart and map where they are in terms of their personal or organisational identity. I'll give you a few examples from each column. So the first one is white supremacy. Some examples of that are subscribes to scientific racism, characterised by the white gaze, a belief that we live in meritocracy. The onus is on Black people to accept their place. So those are some examples of white supremacy. In terms of white indifference, that might look like a self-concept that is based on being rational and moral, which results in avoidance of responsibility for discriminatory behaviour. A willingness to tolerate or fetishize, pity the non-white other. Characterized by a refusal to take a serious look at racism and views anti-racist initiatives as ideological endeavours linked to culture wars and political correctness. And finally, the onus is on Black people to build up their resilience. So those were some indicators of white indifference. In terms of white awareness, functions like a mental illness that only white people have, hence the focus is on discovering unconscious bias and cognitive distortions. White privilege is recognized and becomes a source of shame and embarrassment. And the onus is on white people to overcome unconscious bias. And then finally, white allyship. So some indicators of that would include characterized by the desire to take responsibility for change, which is not restricted to behavior alone. A rejection of deficit models and acceptance of the link between white privilege and educational outcomes. A white ally is willing to share power, privilege, risk, and vulnerability. And finally, the onus is on white people to build sustained partnerships with Black people. So you can see there's the real difference from white supremacy to white allyship and the different steps in between and the indicators of those. It's a really powerful infographic, that I think, and it was created by Gurnam Singh that I mentioned before. Here's another infographic, and this one is called The 4 Dimensions of Racism. I'll not cover each one in depth just for brevity, but the first one is institutional, the next one is structural, then internalized, and then interpersonal. And you can see how they're layered on top of each other there. Again, a really useful concept to comprehend. Here are the 3 typical organizational responses when attempting to tackle racial inequality. So from my cultured social work experience, the responses below generally indicate an organization's prioritization and level of commitment or not to anti-racism. I'll not cover each of these in depth, again, just for brevity. But the first one is to keep silent, keep things the same, and hope all this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. This kind of inaction and paralysis of fear correlates with and reinforces perceptions of white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy for some people of colour. The next type of response is to publish lukewarm organisational statements that recycle and regurgitate previous rhetoric on workforce unity with predictable and borderline offensive platitudes, often proposing only superficial changes. And finally, publishing an authentic anti-racism action plan outlining significant reforms that commit to specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. And I outlined some examples in the next slide. The real acid test is to share this presentation with your social work leaders and to see what response you get. Now, this presentation is one that I deliver to not only students and within sort of academia, but also in workplaces, usually pre-COVID, and also, you know, kind of other forums as well. So the real test, I feel, is the response from social work leaders when they're faced with this kind of information and what their response is. Here is a visual representation of that previous slide. So you'll see there the first type of response is dismal, noteworthy silences. So the ball here would go straight into the crowd, nowhere near the net. The second is fluffed it, one-on-one with the goalkeeper and hits the bar. Cringe position statements, feeble blogs. And then the third is a goal, which would involve an authentic anti-racism action plan with all the outcomes that I talked about before. Okay. I alluded to before in the written version of that previous slide about some of the different ways then in which anti-racism could be promoted and embedded and implemented. So there are 4 different strands. The first is around accelerating diversity within the organization. The next is educating, empowering, and equipping people. The third is leading by example. And the fourth is building transparency. Again, I'll not labor this slide just for brevity, but just so you get a flavor. Accelerating diversity within would involve building a workforce more reflective of the communities that we serve by promoting opportunities for Black and ethnic minority people to enter and advance within the organization. So that might involve a new fast track scheme, for example, that would look at targeting recruitment for senior leadership. Educating, empowering, and equipping people, that will involve transforming the culture to a zero tolerance of discrimination, not just anti-racism, but any sort of discrimination. So I'm thinking of the protected characteristics and other types of identities that people might have in terms of disability, gender, and so on. In terms of educating, empowering, and equipping people, I believe it's important that education is provided in a way that meets different learning styles, which is one of the points that I make there. And it will go beyond routine online training. It will actually be tailored to different people's needs. In terms of leading by example, this is ensuring that senior leaders have a greater understanding of the issues faced by people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And every senior leader will commit to having a reverse mentor, which I'll talk about briefly later on, or they will provide a service to a local group that serves an ethnic minority community. And in terms of building transparency, this is really about data collection. So data collection gaps will be identified, senior leaders will be held to account, staff will be encouraged to self-declare their identity, and then the organization will look to build a profile of the workforce's diverse needs, and then look to meet those needs. I also talk about an annual ethnicity pay audit, which will promote equality in pay. Throughout the course of my career, I've observed many different discrepancies within organizations in terms of race, also other factors as well in terms of gender and so on. But I believe having this kind of ethnicity dashboard approach will promote equality in terms of race. Here is another infographic. This one is called Becoming Anti-Racist. You'll see that we move from the fear zone through the learning zone to the growth zone. I'll not labor this infographic. I think it speaks for itself. And of course, you'll be able to look at it in your own time when you get this presentation. So what needs to happen nationally? Social work has a long history of committing to anti-discriminatory practice, but less in the way of practical mandatory implementation or robust challenge on these issues. Now is the time for the profession to properly address this. Anti-racism in social work requires the prioritisation of sector leaders, including the chief social workers, Social Work England, directors of social services, and other key stakeholders to meaningfully and purposefully move this agenda forward to establish a mandatory anti-discriminatory national framework that is universal across social work in collaboration with BASW. Now you'll notice that I refer to anti-discriminatory national framework because, as I say, this isn't just about race and very much about equality across the board. And I think that a vital step in making that stride forward really is having a mandatory framework. An important first step would be to explicitly reintroduce anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive practices and anti-racist values and ethics into the professional and qualifying education and training standards. And I talk there about sort of partnership between key stakeholders and around the key objectives, which would be about ensuring consistency, introducing the mandatory requirements, emphasizing the appropriate values and being universally applicable and not just applicable to, say, children and families or mental health or adults, but across the whole board. We all know that organizations can sometimes be avoidant of anti-racism, but as social workers, we must recognize that silence or inaction on racism is complicity with white supremacy. Unfortunately, as a profession, we have been complacent and have much more to do to cultivate equality, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace and society. The BAME conundrum. Labels and terms such as Commonwealth, hostile environment, and BAME need to be re-examined. BAME does not describe who I am. BAME is a clumsy, cluttered, and incoherent acronym that is opportune for categorizing people of colour as a homogeneous group, when we quite clearly are not. Of course, I cannot speak for all people of colour. I understand that BAME can be operationally helpful when exploring the overarching effects of all things racist. However, it misses so much nuance and subtlety that it can be seized upon by those who wish to deny racism as a white problem. Routinely, I hear people comfortably stating that BAME people can't even agree amongst themselves. This sloppy reductivism leads to terms being invented such as black on black crime. I've never heard about white on white crime, ever. Okay, the next few slides, and there aren't many, I have to say, is quite idealistic, I suppose, around my vision that I have for what an anti-racist working environment might look like. I also talk about what social work employers can do to promote anti-racism in the workplace and what the experience would be like for people on the receiving end, Black and ethnic minority social workers. So very quickly, in terms of recruitment, anti-racist recruitment targets are set to employ Black and ethnic minority senior leaders. The Rooney Rule is adopted, similar to senior recruitment in American football, which involves at least one person of colour candidate being interviewed for each senior leader vacancy. And the web link there will tell you more about the Rooney Rule when you get this presentation. I'm not going to cover all this slide in depth, but just from an operations point of view, I feel it's important that organisations have a mission or position statement in terms of anti-racism. There's a good example there that you could look at. I also think it's important that other forms of discrimination are also explicitly mentioned in that position statement and condemned, but also action as to how that workplace will tackle those issues. I also think it's important that these sentiments are included in the relevant policies and procedures and that they form part of employees' employment contracts to underline its importance. So when people sign up to work for an organisation, they're effectively signing up to those values and ethics, which I think is important. I talked already about the protected characteristics, different examples being ethnicity, gender, religion, sexuality, etc. I believe that this should allow workplaces and organisations to provide support for different minority groups within the workplace. Training will be provided for all staff and included in the policies and procedures, as I mentioned. And I talk here more about the self-declaration of identity and how workplace provisions are developed in partnership with people, with staff members around the support and protections they need in the workplace. And creative well-being at work is developed, different provisions are developed around that to support people who have faced workplace trauma, whether that be to do with racism or any other form of discrimination. I talk about peer-led support groups, and again, employers providing that time for their staff within work time or making it easy for them to be able to access that support. I said I wouldn't labour that slide, so I'll not continue with that, but do look further when you get your copy. In terms of education, anti-racist education is recognised as being at the heart of developing a more cultured and inclusive workplace. I talk about decolonising social work training programmes with the input of Black and ethnic minority academics, social workers and service users, integrated at all levels of programme development and delivery. I talk about the values and ethics that I've talked about already, forming a fundamental and mandatory requirement of social workers' professional development and registration, so it's explicitly mentioned. This includes a range of educational tools and training opportunities for different learning styles to ensure that cultural diversity education is prioritised and valued. I give a little bit more of an insight there into staff better understanding microaggressions, stereotypes, and how they can demonstrate anti-racist practice. Those web links will give you more examples of how that can be implemented. The expertise of specialist trainers and consultants is instrumental in shaping effective anti-racist approaches with no reliance on tokenistic online courses. And I think that's important. I don't believe that anti-racism can be taught in an effective way just through an online course. I'm even a bit skeptical about sort of speaking virtually like this, but I have no choice at the moment. And that's why I call this very much a presentation as opposed to a training course, because I feel it does have its limitations in this format, but hopefully it resonates. The next slide is about allyship. Hopefully, you know, you've got a lot from us this morning in terms of allyship. I know Maris hasn't been able to join us for a lot of the presentation, but I think you will have seen indications of what type of ally she is and, you know, what she stands for and so on. And I think it's a key aspect of anti-racism generally. So anti-racism allyship is understood by senior leaders, educators and practitioners to be vital in combating all manifestations of racism. Educating, empowering and equipping allies to actively support colleagues from marginalised and minority groups is common practice. So you can see here in this idealistic kind of environment that I've created, all these things are in place and what they might look like. And I think that, you know, we can work backwards and kind of build in the steps that we need to be able to get there. That's my feeling. It's really about how much of a priority it is. Allyship actively promotes ways in which managers and staff can become allies or become better allies to support their Black and ethnic minority colleagues. Social work employers and educators demonstrate they are willing to keep listening and learning from people of colour to instigate meaningful change. Here is an infographic just to consolidate that previous slide. Again, I'll not cover it in huge depth, but the headings on this infographic are appetite, ask, accept, acknowledge, apologise, assume, and action. And there are some subheadings there that I'd encourage you to look at when you get a minute. In terms of reverse mentoring that I covered earlier on, anti-racist reverse mentoring enables Black and ethnic minority social workers to mentor senior leaders and educators on anti-racism, especially those with identified anti-racist needs. And that's a slight euphemism. It is important reverse mentoring allows mentors some autonomy in their approach. Furthermore, mentoring agreements furthermore, mentoring agreements considering confidentiality, power dynamics, and conflict resolution are agreed and signed by both parties at the outset for the obvious protections that would be needed. And finally, I talk about leadership programs and the need to combat glass ceiling racism. The BPS group that I talked about earlier on that I said I'd formed at BASW, we had an event last year called Smashing the Glass Ceiling, which some of you may have attended virtually. And that was about promoting the employment skills and all the expertise that's needed in terms of getting to that next level in social work. Because what we find is actually there's a glass ceiling. People only progress so far. So, this is really about combating that. And ways in which that can be done are through positive representation, recognizing the disadvantages and the obstacles for people of colour, and providing opportunities. So traditional mentoring, nominations, secondments, shadowing, etc. And then finally, I talk about the representational imbalance, ring-fenced investment and the importance of that, and ensuring that Black and ethnic minority people who do progress, that they actually get the support that they need when they get there, because they can be so few and far between. Okay, and that's the last slide from me. I just need to say that normally this is a far longer presentation that I deliver. Usually it's a half-day course. So forgive me if that was very quick. I've tried to condense a lot of information in there, but I hope that was useful. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. That was really good. And as Wayne's agreed, I will share the presentation with everyone. I have had an email from Maris apologising that her connection just went. She couldn't.
Oh, right, yeah, not to worry. Yeah.
So I think if we've got 10 or so minutes for some questions. So please use the Q&A function for this. And if there's any questions for Wayne or for Anna, who I think is still with us. Are you okay to stop sharing your
I will. Yeah, let me do that.
Just so I can, yeah, Anna, I just want to check if Anna's still. Hi, Anna.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you could use this function. So there's a question here from Kelly. You can ask questions anonymously as well. A question from Kelly. For those, just bear with me. Yeah, for those who have visited the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, do you feel there's anything missing in terms of educating people visiting of slavery and discrimination?
Okay.
One has any comments?
In terms of that question, I mean, I visited the Slavery Museum a few years ago now, took my children there, and it was great. I think my feeling was, at the time, and more so since, is we need more of those museums. We need more of that recognition, really, of that history that exists, and the brutal facts of that, really, for all of us to learn and move forward. And whilst ever it's as selective as it is in terms of different curriculums, I just think, we're always going to be in this kind of position where you have people who, will almost go so far as to say slavery never happened, or it wasn't as bad as what Black people make out. I think, we really need to embolden the kind of the education that is out there, that does exist, but it's just not part of the national curriculum, either pre-school or kind of pre-16 or post-16 in terms of further education. That's my view.
Okay, so if I can come in on that point, anybody who's been to the International Slavery Museum can see the story of enslavement told, in great detail. And whilst we have to respect the context of enslavement and the history around that, my feelings may be slightly different than most people's, because I also believe that the constant conversation about enslavement actually keeps us shackled as a society and limits us moving forward. So what I would like to see within the International Slavery Museum is now to start looking about Black people and our contributions to society, all the positive contributions that have been erased from history. Telling the positive stories about what we've done, historically, what we do now and what we hope to achieve in the future. And whilst I've worked quite closely with International Slavery Museum, and I'm still working with them as part of the Respect group, this is something that we're exploring at the moment about how we change the narrative going forward. Less focus on the historical context, more focus on the positive contributions made by many people.
Thank you, Anna. Got a question here. Should we be looking at terms we use normally? So, for example, immigrants or expats, etc.
I do think that there are discussions to be had around language, and I touched on some of that in my presentation with regards to BAME, which I'm not a huge fan of. For me, I think it's about supporting minority groups to organise. That's part of the solution, in that as part of allowing them to organise, it then means that they can self-identify. So they can then decide what they want to be called as a group. They can, speak to their particular communities, and we can progress that way in terms of language. But because of this kind of disorganization that we have, and the fact that groups are marginalized and they have less of a voice, there tends to be a kind of done to rather than done with approach. And so these labels are just kind of put on groups of people, which is how I believe we arrived at BAME. That would be my take.
I think the really important conversation, which is taking place nationally and internationally, but the conversation taking place in Liverpool as part of our Liverpool City Council task force, the Race Equality Task Force, is precisely about language and how names are apportioned to different groups. And this is a really complex area. This is not something that can be discussed in a short period of time, because what we constantly see is Black people being treated as a homogenous group. Nobody takes into account that we are made up of many like-minded people, but we all have our different norms and values that we work to. And so when you start labeling people to that level, then you miss all that information that is included within that name. And so the conversation is going to be a difficult conversation. And just as an example, as a child of the 60s who grew up with, the Black Panthers and Angela Davis, Black for us was, taking a word that had been used in a negative narrative and empowering ourselves as a Black community and embracing our Blackness. However, things change. And now when you come all these years forward and you look at younger people and they embrace the terminology around Black and brown people, there are so many other labels that are replacing that label. But, this conversation has to take place because it is about self-defining, self-definition. And we have to be comfortable with what we are known as going forward. I mean, it is complex, and the reality is we know that we don't want to be known as BAME. But in terms of the conversation and that taking place, we don't know what we're going to replace that with. And so we have to kind of come to some kind of holding name in terms of, an example is the program with Hope University, the Black Access course, a route into social work or a route into the profession for people from diverse communities. I mean, it's an awfully long, statement. It's a bit of a tongue-tie statement to get across. But, we're dealing in times where, we need to give people space to have the conversation. We very rarely get the opportunity to discuss and debate these big topics. And it has to be done in a timely fashion, and done in terms of taking people out of their comfort zones. But also, it's a huge issue, not just around the label, but about Black Lives Matters, about people being treated with dignity and respect. and having a voice, having a voice, and bringing to the table that voice so that we can make sure that going forward we use the correct language.
Thank you. So we've got a question from an anonymous attendee. How would we become a good ally in a situation of confronting racism in a way that we don't take away anyone's voice, but that shows support?
Okay, I like that question. I think there's multiple ways that could be approached. A lot of it, I think, depends. I mean, there's so many variables in each situation. I think a lot has to be said for good intention, really. So an example that springs to mind for me is in my previous role, I worked for a fostering agency, and I used to have to do, it's a very broad role, but part of the role involved speaking to people who were interested in fostering. So I'd visit their homes and some I would assess and so on. And occasionally we would get to a section in the assessment where we would talk about equality and diversity. And, some of the views that people held, some of the terminology that they used was really quite shocking. But I once had somebody say to me, well, don't mind blacks, but I don't like Pakis. So all that sort of stuff, and quite often, it involved a judgment on my part of where, what was that comment about? What does that mean? Does that reflect that person's level of knowledge? Not so much their sort of bad intention, but more about their lack of education around how terminology, certain terminology is just not acceptable. Others, such as coloured, which I've been called in the past as well, people have not meant that necessarily offensively, but because of how language has changed over the years and decades, people have said that quite innocuously. And then when I've said, actually, can be seen as offensive, that, and I've sort of addressed that in whatever way I felt appropriate at the time, if that person has shown a level of kind of, well, actually, I didn't know that, but now I know, I won't use that term. And, if their intention is clear, then I think that goes a long way. But quite often, I think that there can be what I referred to in my presentation as white fragility and this paralysis of fear. And with that, sometimes I think it can cause people to be a little bit bristly and not want to perhaps take on board any new ideas or somebody's lived experience or whatever. They become quite defensive. So I think, going back to the question, in terms of allyship, for me, it's about intention, it's about authenticity, it's about recognizing that it's a continuous journey, and being sort of comfortably vulnerable, I guess, just to sum it up.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Wayne, on the topic. But I think it's also in terms of practical terms. We need to create safe spaces where this dialogue can take place. I find with the research that I've done, looking at businesses per se, in terms of recruitment of Black people, this is a known. This is not unknown. I've poached on the moral case for many, many years, and gave that up many years ago because I used to see that glazed appearance in people's eyes. But approaching it from a business case, a robust business case of why it makes good business sense to ensure that we not only employ people from Black communities, but we also ensure that we do everything within our power to create those safe spaces, goes down a lot better because people can see the bottom line. And for those of us who are socially conscious, the triple bottom line. And so not just the financial bottom line, but the social responsibility, etc. But it's also interesting to look at one of the things that I've initiated is the language amnesty. And that is about giving people that confidence to have the conversation about the language that they use and the language that's perpetuated throughout their organizations. And so the only thing I ask of people is that they come with an open mind and they're prepared to leave the language that they use on the table. And by the time they finish the session, they should walk away with confidence and awareness about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate language to use. And so there are ways and means of bringing allies on board. You know, that old, you know, battering people over the head, you know, accusations of racism, etc. It doesn't work, because all it does is people become entrenched and refuse to move forward. And so we have to do it in a way where we're imparting information about what it's like to be a Black person trying to function within an inherently racist structure. And so to give some people insight into what it's like to be a Black man or a Black woman. And so, yeah, so that's my position on that.
I agree with that. I like the term language amnesty, Anna. I'll have to recycle that one.
As long as you give me reference.
I will. I'll credit you.
Okay, I can see lots of questions in the chat and the Q&A, but I'm very conscious we need to keep to the schedule, because we have got the guests lined up and everyone needs to have a comfort break and grab a coffee in between. So obviously we're online and we can't see all the participants. There's nearly 190, but if we were in lecture theatre today, I'd be asking you to please give Anna and Wayne and Maris, even though she lost us, a big round of applause. So I'll do that on everyone's behalf. I really enjoyed that, and we're really grateful that you joined us today, and hopefully we'll keep in touch
Yeah,
with how our project develops alongside.
that would be good.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so just a reminder that I'll end this webinar, and there's a separate link for everyone to join on the schedule for the 11:15 one. So thanks again, and we'll see you shortly.
Thanks, everyone.